There is a kind of tired that sleep cannot fix. Varka knew this tired the way she knew the shape of every tree in Bone Valley, the way she knew which roots held the hillside together after rain, the way she knew the sound the wind made when it came down off the ridge, carrying the first real cold of the season. She knew it in her bones, in her hands, in the space behind her eyes that hadn't gone fully dark in 11 years. She was crouching at the edge of a dry creek bed, 3 hours north of home, holding a torch low to the ground and reading the story the earth was trying to tell her. Deer tracks, 2 days old, heading west. A rabbit hole, empty. The ghost of something larger that had passed through maybe a week ago and hadn't come back. 3 weeks of this. 3 weeks of leaving before dawn and coming back after dark with nothing to show for it but cold feet and the particular shame of a hunter who cannot find what her people need. The Appalachian Mountains in late autumn were not generous. They had never been generous. But there had always been enough before. Enough deer, enough elk, enough of something to carry back to the fire and lay down with pride. The animal gesture of a clan that was surviving and intended to keep surviving. This season, the mountains were quiet in a way that felt like a message. Senna came up beside her without a sound. That was Senna's gift, moving through the world without announcing herself, sliding between shadows like she was made of the same dark material as the spaces between trees. The scar on her face caught the torchlight, a pale line running from her left temple down to her jaw, a record of a moment 15 years ago that she had survived and never once spoken about in the specific way that people never spoke about the things that had changed them most completely. Anything? Senna asked. Her voice was quiet, not hopeful. Senna had stopped performing hope about hunting 3 weeks ago, around the same time Varka had stopped pretending not to notice. Nothing, Varka said. Senna looked at the tracks, then at Varka, then back at the darkness between the trees, the way a person looked at something they had been dreading for a long time and were finally allowing themselves to see clearly. Winter's coming fast, she said. I know. We got maybe 6 weeks of stored food, 7 if we stretch it. I know. Varka. The other 4, Zelka and the rest, they're looking to you. Varka stood, rolled her shoulders back, put the torch out because the light was doing more harm than good, announcing their location to every animal within a mile. She let the darkness settle around her like a coat she had worn so long, she no longer noticed its weight. She knew what Senna wasn't saying. Senna was good at that, saying the necessary thing right up to the edge, and then stopping, leaving the worst of it unspoken so it could hang in the air between them like smoke that everyone could smell, but no one was required to name. What Senna wasn't saying was this: they were not just facing a hard winter. They were facing the particular arithmetic of a clan that had been counting down for a long time and was running out of numbers. 38 women, no men. The youngest children were the daughters of older mothers, born in the first years after the last man died. Those children were grown now. Zelka was 19. Some of the others were older. None of them had any real memory of what the clan had been before, when there were children everywhere, and the settlement sounded different, fuller, louder, with a kind of noise that was harder to define than simply the presence of more voices. Varka remembered. She had been 23 when Bren died. Bren, who had been the last, who had been kind and capable, and who had simply not woken up one morning because years of fighting off everything the mountains could throw at you would eventually find a way through even the strongest body. She remembered the morning they found him, remembered Elder Mora beginning to sing immediately, automatically, as if song were the only language that could contain something that large. Remembered herself standing very still in the doorway of the longhouse, thinking, this is it. This is the moment everything changes. She had been right. She had been right in ways that took years to fully understand, the way certain truths were too large to see all at once and had to be absorbed in pieces, slowly, over the course of living with them. Move on, she told Senna quietly. We check the eastern ridge before we go back. Senna didn't argue. That was also one of Senna's gifts, knowing when argument had reached its limit. They moved through the forest in a line, 6 of them, the hunting party that had become more ritual than function over the past 3 weeks. Varka at the front, Senna at her left shoulder. Zelka at the back, the youngest, the one who moved with the unconscious grace of someone who had grown up learning the forest the way other people learn language. not as a subject of study, but as the medium of her existence, the thing she thought in as much as the thing she moved through. The eastern ridge gave them nothing. They were turning back when Zelka made a sound. Not a word, a breath, shaped into something between a question and a warning. Varka stopped. The others stopped. 6 bodies going still at exactly the same moment. The hunting reflex older than thought, the thing the body knew before the mind caught up. Then Varka smelled it. Smoke. Not good wood smoke, the deep, clean smoke of a fire built by someone who understood fire. This was thin, uncertain, the kind that came from green wood and insufficient kindling, the kind that a fire produced when it was struggling to stay alive against weather that had already decided to win. She moved toward it. Senna's hand touched her arm, one finger, the most minimal possible form of the word wait. Varka kept moving. The clearing was small, protected on 3 sides by old oaks whose roots had broken through the limestone and grabbed the hillside like something that refused to let go. The 4th side opened onto a drop, not a cliff, but steep enough to make descent difficult. Someone had found this place and decided it was defensible, or close enough to defensible to matter to someone who had run out of better options. The fire in the center was exactly as pitiful as the smoke had suggested. Small, nervous, throwing orange light across a circle of maybe 10 feet before the darkness took over completely. And in the center of that light, crouched over the fire with his hands held out toward it, like a man warming himself at a candle, was a human. A man. Varka stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at him with the full attention she brought to things that required understanding before they required action. He was around 6 feet tall, though it was hard to tell with him crouched that way. Medium build, but the kind of medium that came from weight lost rather than weight never gained. She could see it in the way his coat hung on him, in the thinness of his wrists where they emerged from the cuffs. Dark hair gone unwashed and ragged at the edges. A beard that had started as something deliberate and become something else entirely. His hands were rough, the knuckles of someone who had spent years doing hard physical things and hadn't stopped doing them even when circumstances suggested he should. He had a sword at his hip that he wasn't reaching for. He was just cold. He was just sitting there in the dark, cold and alone, warming himself at a fire that was going to go out before morning, and his eyes, when she finally saw them, were fixed on the flames with the particular blankness of a person who had run out of things to think about and was now simply existing, waiting for whatever came next without the energy to invest much in what that might be. She had seen that look before. She saw it sometimes in the morning, in certain faces around the clan's central fire. Women who were working and surviving and continuing because continuing was what you did, but who had stopped somewhere along the way being able to explain to themselves exactly why. She had felt it herself, though she had never allowed herself to show it. That was not the luxury afforded to the person at the front of the line. "We should keep moving," Senna said beside her. Her voice was just above a breath. "He's not worth the risk. Bringing a stranger back?" She stopped. They both knew how the sentence finished. Varka looked at the man by the dying fire. She thought about the eastern ridge and the empty deer trails, and the numbers that didn't work no matter how many ways you arranged them. She thought about 38 women and the sound of the settlement in the morning, and the other kind of sound underneath it, the absence that sat below everything like a low note that never resolved, the silence where a different future had stopped. She stepped into the clearing. She heard Senna's breath catch, heard the rustling as the others followed, because that was what you did when the leader moved. Even Senna moved. The man's hand went to his sword before his body finished turning. Fast, trained, 3 years of something hard built into his reflexes before his mind had a chance to weigh in. But he didn't draw. He rested his hand on the pommel and went still, looking at 6 orc women who had appeared out of the dark around his fire. And he waited. Varka looked at him, looking at them. She watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. Fast, thorough, the professional habit of a soldier processing a new situation with the speed that survival required. He reached a conclusion. She could see it settle over him. Not panic, not the frantic energy of someone who wasn't ready. Something quieter than that. He thought he was going to die. But he had decided sometime before tonight, maybe weeks before tonight, that this was acceptable. He had made his peace with the direction things were heading. That was what the blankness around his eyes had been. Not absence of thought, but the particular stillness of a person who had done their accounting and found the numbers came out to a place they could live with, or die with, as the case may be. "My name is Varka," she said. Her accent was what it was. She had learned the human tongue from Elder Mora, who had learned it from someone else, and it had passed through enough hands to carry the shape of something older underneath the modern words. "Leader of the Bone Valley hunting party," she gestured at the fire. "That is the worst fire I have ever seen." The man looked at it, looked at her. "Probably," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, measured. Each word chosen with the care of someone who understood that words might be the only weapon he had left and intended to use them well. "You're lost," she said. "3 weeks lost," he said. "Does it show?" Not quite a question. She filed it away. Senna stepped forward on her left, positioning herself the way she always did in uncertain situations. The posture that said, "I'm here and I disagree with whatever's happening, but I'm here regardless, because that is what I do." The other four fanned out without being told. Old habit. The geometry of enclosure, of removing the variable of escape from the equation. The man tracked all of it, said nothing about it. Varka crouched down to his level, which was an unusual thing for her to do, and she knew it. It was not the posture of someone asserting power. She had spent 11 years perfecting the posture of someone asserting power, and this was something else, a decision she was making in the moment, without entirely understanding why, the kind of decision that came from something below the level of strategy. "You're not prey," she said. The man's gray-green eyes held hers. "Then what am I?" he said. She told him the truth, because lying would have been the first mistake, and she did not intend to make it. "You're something rarer," she said. "You're a man." The word landed in the space between them, and the fire crackled, and somewhere above the clearing, something moved through the dark branches and went quiet. He worked through it. She watched the calculation happen. Not numbers this time, but the simpler, heavier arithmetic of a situation that added up to something final. His eyes moved across the six of them, and she saw him seeing them properly. Not as a threat to be neutralized, but as what they were. Women who had been hunting for 3 weeks in mountains that had given them nothing, carrying something heavier than hunger home. "Your clan," he said slowly. "No males." "Our males died," she said. "War. Accident. The mountain takes what it takes. The last one died a long time ago. We've survived. We're strong." She paused. "But strength doesn't make children." Silence. "And if I say no," he asked, "if I say no to whatever you're about to propose?" She met his eyes steadily. "We give you food," she said. "We point you toward human territory. We let you go." Just like that. Her gold eyes held his without moving. "We're not monsters," she said. "We're desperate. There is a difference between those two things, and I want you to understand that difference before you make any decision." Behind her, she heard Senna's short exhale. She knew exactly what Senna was thinking. She agreed with most of it. But there were problems that logic alone couldn't reach. And Senna, for all her gifts, had always been slightly uncomfortable in that territory. The man looked at the fire, then at his hands. He reached into his coat pocket, the left one, the one without the hole worn through at the seam, and pulled out something small. A compass, brass worn smooth from years of being handled, held, touched. He looked at it for a moment without seeming to see it. The way you looked at something your hands knew better than your eyes did. "My name is Garrett," he said. Varka stood. "Then follow us, Garrett," she said. "Or don't. But that fire will be out before midnight, and you will be very cold before dawn." He stood. He followed. The walk back took 3 hours. 3 hours through terrain that would have killed a man alone. Not dramatically, not with sudden violence, but with the patient indifference of a mountain that simply didn't distinguish between a boulder and a body. Varka moved at the front and did not slow down for him, but she chose her paths with a deliberateness she didn't usually bother with. Routes that someone unfamiliar with the landscape could follow without losing an ankle or a confidence. She was aware of him behind her the entire way. She was aware of Senna behind him, watching. Zelka walked beside Garrett through the middle section of the route and asked him things the way very young people ask things, directly, without the elaborate social scaffolding that older people built around their curiosity to make it appear less exposed. Zelka had grown up in a clan of women who said what they meant, and she had internalized this completely. "Is it true humans bury their dead?" she asked. Garrett was quiet for a moment, picking his way over a root system that Varka had stepped over without breaking stride. "Yeah, we do." "Why?" He thought about it, which she could tell because the quality of his silence changed when he was thinking versus when he was simply not speaking. "A few reasons," he said, "partly practical. Mostly it's about returning them to the earth. Like planting, like giving back what was borrowed." Zelka considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything she decided was worth considering. "We burn ours, send them back to the sky. Burying feels like hiding, like you're ashamed of something." "We don't see it that way," Garrett said. "More like the ground holds things, keeps them close." Zelka went quiet for a while, which was unusual enough that Varka noticed it from the front of the line. "Then Tyurek them. Do you have someone buried? Someone you'd want to go back to?" Varka did not turn around, but she adjusted her pace by a fraction, the smallest possible change, and she listened. "My father," Garrett said, 8 years ago. "Was he a warrior?" "No, a carpenter. He made furniture. Good furniture. The kind that stayed together for generations. The kind people kept. Then you carry his craft in your hands," Zelka said. "His knowledge in your body. That's not so different from what we do." "I don't make furniture." "No," Zelka said, "but you carry something he made." Varka kept walking. The words stayed with her the rest of the way home. The settlement appeared through the trees the way it always did. Gradually, the darkness organizing itself into shapes. The smell of wood smoke and the close-lived warmth of people who shared walls and fire arriving before the lights did. Familiar, known. The smell of a place that held people who depended on you, which was both the heaviest and the most sustaining smell she knew. Varka walked into the central clearing, and the settlement stopped. It always paused when the hunting party returned, but this pause was different from the pause that had become routine over the past weeks, freighted with the weight of returned hands and empty expectations. This was something else entirely, and she felt it before she saw it in their faces. 38 people registering simultaneously, something they had not allowed themselves to picture too concretely, something that lived in the territory between hope and superstition. A man, not an orc man, a human man, standing in the firelight of Bone Valley in his worn coat and 3 weeks of beard and gray-green eyes going slowly around the circle of faces turned toward him, reading the room the way soldiers read rooms, cataloging everything before committing to anything. The silence was complete. Even the children were still, and children were almost never still. Varka walked through the silence to the center of it and turned to face her clan. She did this with the posture that 11 years of leadership had built into her skeleton. Shoulders back, chin level, gold eyes moving steadily across every face she knew better than she knew her own hands. "This is Garrett," she said. "He was lost in the ridge country. He's considering." The word she chose, considering, was deliberate. It had specific meaning in the Bone Valley vocabulary, a meaning everyone present understood without it being explained. Considering meant looking. Deciding nothing yet. Don't push. Elder Mora shuffled forward. Elder Mora was older than anyone could precisely calculate. Her skin was the color of old moss, deep green fading to gray at her temples and the backs of her hands. Years had bent her forward like a letter read too many times, folded and refolded along the same creases until the paper had softened to something approaching transparency. But her eyes were the sharpest thing in the settlement, sharp as the obsidian blade she still wore at her hip, despite no longer being able to lift it with any real effect. Sharp as the winter she'd outlasted that everyone said she wouldn't. She looked at Garrett the way she looked at everything, completely, without hurry, as if time were something that happened to other people. Then she began to sing. It was her oldest habit, the one none of them had ever been able to modify, and most of them had long since stopped trying. She sang the way other people breathed, automatically, as if silence required the effort and song were the resting state, the natural position of a person who was paying full attention to the world. "A human man," she sang, "in the valley so deep. Green hands reaching, promises to keep." Varka briefly closed her eyes. "Elder Mora," she said, "this is Garrett." Mora stopped singing, looked at Varka with the particular expression she reserved for interruptions she found philosophically objectionable. I know who he is, Morris said. I sang it. She turned back to Garrett and leaned forward, close enough that Varka imagined Garrett could smell the wood smoke and the dried herbs that Mora kept about her person at all times. A collection she refreshed every autumn with the focused ritual of someone who understood exactly which plants did what. You look hungry, Mora said. We feed you. We talk. We show you we are not terrible. Then you decide. Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then, that's fair. Fair is a myth, Mora said pleasantly. But we try. She turned and shuffled toward the central fire, already resuming the song, something now about hospitality and the nature of unexpected arrivals. She does that, Varka said. Songs always. She cannot tell a story without music. And then a small person ran into Garrett's legs from nowhere in particular, with the velocity of someone who had not yet fully internalized that other people were solid objects with separate trajectories. Small, green, gap-toothed, 8 years old, completely without the social caution that might have given her pause at a moment like this. Pip, who had apparently assessed the situation and determined that the primary quality of a human man appearing in the settlement was that it was interesting, and that being interested was the correct response to interesting things. She looked up at him with enormous dark eyes and both hands full of objects. I have things, she announced. Garrett looked down at her. Then, without appearing to think about it, he crouched, bringing himself to her level the way some adults did with children, the automatic geometry of someone who understood that a conversation between people of different heights was already unequal, and that this was worth correcting. What things, he said. Pip spread her treasures with the reverence of a curator presenting a permanent collection. A button, heavy brass, with an animal carved into its face. A piece of fabric, torn at the edges, with embroidery along one border in a blue that had mostly faded to gray. A spoon, small, bent at the neck, still faintly useful. A length of braided leather cord. Found them, Pip said, from the old places, the human places. Varka watched Garrett's face with the careful attention she brought to things that might be important. She had expected indifference. She had expected the mild interest of someone looking at objects they had no particular connection to. The polite acknowledgement of a stranger confronted with a child's hobby. This was, after all, a reasonable expectation. He had no reason to care about objects he didn't recognize. What she found instead was pain. Quiet, controlled, the kind that a person with years of practice could almost entirely conceal. But not entirely. Not from someone who had spent 11 years learning to read faces that were trying very hard to hold themselves together because that was the skill that kept a leader useful, and her reading was accurate. He knew what these things were. Not specifically, he couldn't know the particular soldiers, the individual lives, but he recognized the category of origin. He understood that a button and a spoon and a piece of embroidered cloth in this location, in this condition, had come from people who no longer needed them because they no longer existed. And it moved something in him. Varka did not look away from his face for a long moment. This is a lion, Garrett said. His voice was steady. She could hear the steadiness, costing him something small but real. It's a big cat, from the southern kingdoms. Pip's eyes went very wide. A real one? How big? Big enough that you'd know if you saw one. Bigger than anything in these mountains. Pip looked at the button with the new reverence that came with upgraded information. Then back at him. Can I keep it? Garrett glanced up at Varka. For just a second, a single held moment, his eyes asked her something she wasn't entirely certain she knew how to answer yet. She kept her expression neutral. Pip, she said, our guest is cold and needs to eat. Show him your collection another time. Pip pouted with the complete commitment that only 8-year-olds could sustain, but she shuffled back toward the fire, clutching her battlefield relics. Garrett stood. She doesn't know, he said quietly, where they came from. She was born after the last border conflict, Varka said. To her, they are simply interesting shapes. Objects that hint at a world bigger than the valley, without the context to understand the cost. Garrett watched Pip's retreating back. Maybe that's a mercy, he said. Varka considered this honestly. Maybe, she said, or maybe it's a debt we owe her. When she's old enough to carry it. Garrett nodded, not agreeing necessarily, acknowledging that she had said something with weight in it, and that weight deserved acknowledgement. They fed him. They fed him roasted meat from the last of the stores and root vegetables pulled from the autumn cellar and bread that Elder Moore had made that morning with the complete attention she brought to everything she considered worth doing, which was everything. Garrett ate with the efficient focus of a man who had been managing not to think about hunger for long enough that allowing himself to eat required a specific internal permission. The clan watched. Not aggressively. Nothing in their attention was threatening. It was closer to the way you watch something you had been trying to imagine for a long time and were now adjusting the imagination to match. Children crept closer in stages, each advanced slightly bolder than the last, the social mathematics of young people testing a boundary in careful increments. The older women found tasks near the central fire. Senna sat at a distance and sharpened a blade that did not need sharpening, her eyes moving steadily between Garrett and Varka. When he finished eating, Garrett set down the plate and looked up at her. "You want to ask something?" she said. He met her eyes. "If I stay," he said, "and I'm not saying I'm staying." He paused, finding the words with the care of someone for whom precision mattered. "If I stay. What am I to you?" He looked at her directly. "Am I a person, or am I a means?" The clan had gone quiet. Even Mora's humming had reduced itself to something below hearing. Varka walked to the fire and sat across from him. She did this deliberately. This was not the posture of leadership addressing a subject. This was the posture of equals having a conversation that mattered, and she wanted the geometry of it to carry that meaning before the words did. "You want to know if you're a person or a tool," she said. He nodded once. She took a breath. "We are desperate," she said. "I will not lie to you about that because dishonesty would be the first crack in whatever this becomes, and I will not build anything on a crack. We have been desperate for years. We will probably still be working our way out of it for years after whatever happens now." She held his gaze steadily. "But desperate is not the same as heartless. There is a difference, and I mean it as fully as I said it to you in the clearing. If you stay as yourself. You choose. You are asked, not commanded. What you can give, you give. What you cannot, you don't. That is how we build. Not with contracts, with consent." Garrett was quiet. "And if the answer is no sometimes," he said. "Then no is no," she said. "We survived a long time without men. We will survive longer if we must." She let that sit. "But we would rather survive with hope," she added. "There's a difference between surviving and surviving towards something." He pulled the compass out again. She watched him turn it over in his hands. The same gesture she had seen in the clearing, automatic, the handling of something carried so long it had become part of the body's habitual movements. Brass gone warm from years of being held. The needle, she could see now, was motionless, not pointing, just resting. "My father gave me this," he said. "Told me it would always show the way home, help me find my way back to what mattered." He looked at it. "It broke during a battle 3 years ago. I kept it anyway. Kept carrying it like if I held on to it long enough, the needle would fix itself." He turned it over. "I'm starting to think home isn't something you find," he said. "I'm starting to think it's something you make." Varka looked at him across the fire. She looked at him with the full assessment she brought to things that might be true. Then she turned her head. Pip had crept back close to the fire and was sitting 3 feet away with her collection still in both hands, listening with the total absorption that children brought to things adults didn't realize were being heard. "Pip," Varka said. Pip straightened, caught. "Come here." Pip came. She stood in front of Garrett with her objects and her enormous eyes, waiting to see what happened next with the patient confidence of someone who expected the world to be interesting. Garrett looked at her. Then he reached into his pocket. He held the compass out. "For your collection," he said. "This one isn't from the old places. It's from my father. He was a good man who made good things. Now it's yours." Pip took it with both hands, the way she received all things she considered significant, seriously, completely, without the performance of gratitude but with the real thing underneath it. She turned it over, studied the brass, the still needle, the small engraving on the back. "What does it do?" she asked. "Used to show the way home," Garrett said. Pip looked at the needle, then up at him with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who hadn't yet acquired the habit of accepting that things were simply broken. "Maybe it still does," she said. "Maybe just different home now." The fire crackled between them. Something moved through Varka that she did not have a clean name for. Not hope exactly, not warmth exactly. Something older than either of those words. Something that lived in the part of a person that keeps going when everything else has given up. Maybe, Garrett said. Maybe you're right. He looked at Varka. I'll see the clan in the morning, he said. Look around properly, and then I'll give you an answer. Varka nodded. Zelka will show you to your tent. It's yours. Private. He stood, and she saw the word register in a way he hadn't quite expected. You thought we'd force you, she said. It crossed my mind. We want hope, Varka said. Not a prisoner. There is no future in prisoners. He looked at her for one more moment with the eyes that saw more than they gave away. Then he nodded, and Zelka appeared at exactly the right moment, because Zelka had excellent instincts and led him toward the edge of the settlement. Varka stayed by the fire. Senna appeared beside her. She always appeared eventually, one of the constants of Varka's life, like the mountain being there in the morning, like the cold coming back every year. You believe him, Senna said. I believe he's lost, Varka said. Same as us, different direction, same condition. That's not an answer. Varka looked at the compass that was no longer in Garrett's hands, but in Pip's. A treasure in a child's collection, a broken thing being believed in anyway. No, she said, but it's where I'm starting. Senna said nothing. The fire burned. Above the settlement, through the bare branches of the Appalachian autumn, the stars were coming out over the ridge. Cold, indifferent, numerous. The same stars that had been there the night the last man died, and the same stars that were there now. Watching a hunting party come home was something that was not prey, and was not a prisoner, and was not quite anything else yet. Something that was, for the first time in a very long time, a possibility. Varka watched the fire and thought about what it cost to let yourself believe in a possibility. She had stopped counting the cost a long time ago. She had never stopped paying it. Part 2. The Ironback Letter. There is a kind of trust that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with ceremony or declaration. It doesn't appear the morning after a decision the way sunlight appeared after dark, clean, and obvious and new. It came the way the season changed in the Appalachian Mountains, gradually, almost without you noticing, 1 degree at a time, until you looked up one morning and realized that everything around you was different from what it had been, and you could not point to the exact moment it shifted. Varka noticed it in small things first. She noticed it in the way Zelka stopped, positioning herself between Garrett and the settlement's edge when they walked together. That unconscious guardian habit, the instinct to place yourself in the path of an uncertain variable, dissolving so quietly that Varka wasn't certain Zelka was aware it was happening. She noticed it in the way the younger children, who had observed him from careful distances in the first 2 weeks, began appearing at his elbow during the morning meal, sitting close with the magnetic shamelessness of children who had decided something was safe and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She noticed it in herself, which was the thing she spent the most time deliberately not examining. 3 months. 3 months of Garrett learning the settlement's rhythms, fitting himself into the gaps with a patience she hadn't expected from a soldier. He learned words in the old tongue, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular stubbornness of someone who understood that language was not just communication, but a form of respect, a way of saying, I am trying to meet you where you live, rather than expecting you to come to where I am. Elder Mora treated this as a personal triumph and began teaching him clan songs, a development that Varka observed with careful neutrality and that Senna observed with barely concealed suffering. He was not perfect. He made mistakes of assumption, carried habits from a life lived elsewhere that occasionally collided with how things were done in Bone Valley. He ate too quickly in the early weeks, the ingrained pace of a soldier who had learned to finish a meal before someone needed him somewhere else. He over-apologized initially, the social machinery of a man raised in one context trying to fit the grooves of another and not always finding purchase on the first attempt. But he worked. He found the places where effort was needed, and he went there without being directed. He helped carry wood when the stores ran low. He showed Zelka 3 different ways to read weather from cloud formation. Practical knowledge she received with the focused attention she brought to anything that increased her effectiveness. He sat with Pip in the evenings while she arranged and rearranged her collection and answered her questions about the human world with the thorough patience of someone who understood that questions from an 8-year-old were rarely as simple as they appeared. Varka kept her distance. This was deliberate, not coldness. She was the leader of this clan. She had been the leader for years, and one of the earliest things she had understood about that role was that distance was not the same as coldness. It was clarity. The person at the front of the line needed to be able to see the whole line, and you couldn't see the whole line if you were standing too deep inside any one part of it. She watched. She assessed. She made the adjustments that needed making and kept the others in her peripheral vision, attending to everything without being absorbed by any of it. She had been very good at this for a long time. It occurred to her once on the eastern ridge in the early morning light that this was also a kind of loneliness. She set the thought down and kept walking. It was Senna who found the letter. Not a letter exactly, a message scratched into bark the way the old clans communicated across distances when runners were too risky and fire signals could be misread. She found it at the eastern border marker, the white oak that had stood as the boundary line between Bone Valley territory and the territories beyond for as long as anyone could remember. It had been placed there deliberately in the specific location that meant it was addressed to whoever tended this border, which meant it was addressed to Varka. Senna brought it without a word, set it on the table in the longhouse, stepped back with her hands at her sides and her face in the configuration it took when she was bracing for something. Varka read it. She read it twice. She set it down with the careful deliberateness of someone making sure their hands did nothing they would regret. The message was from the Ironback clan. The Ironback were the largest orc clan within 3 days' travel. Not neighbors exactly, but adjacent in the way a storm system was adjacent to a valley, present and significant without being immediately upon you. Large, organized, powerful in the way clans became powerful, when they had survived long enough and fought hard enough to convince everyone around them that the cost of conflict exceeded the cost of accommodation. They had weathered every border war by being useful to whoever needed them and dangerous to whoever didn't, and they had 40 warriors to Bone Valley's hunting party of 6. The message was precise and economical, which was itself a kind of threat. The Ironback had received information. The message did not say how and did not need to, that Bone Valley was harboring a human male. The Ironback noted that this was, depending on your reading of the current arrangement between human territories and orc lands, either a liability or an asset. They were interested in the asset. The message offered 2 things, a warning and a request. The warning was implicit but legible. Information traveled, and others would know soon, and not all of them would frame it as an offer. The request was for a meeting. Varka read it a 3rd time, then she looked at Senna. Senna's face was its own message, written in the language of a person who has done something they cannot undo and is now in the presence of the person they did it to. "How long have you been talking to them?" Varka said. Her voice was completely level. She had spent years perfecting level. Senna's jaw worked. Once. Then she looked at the table between them. 8 weeks, she said. 8 weeks. I went to them, Senna said. I thought, they have males. They have a surplus sometimes when the hunting goes well and the numbers work in their favor. I thought if we offered something, the southern grazing land we don't use in winter, territory we can spare, they might consider a temporary arrangement. I thought if I found the solution before you had to watch us keep failing. She stopped. Her hands were flat on her thighs. Her face was doing something complicated. The specific complication of a person whose intentions and outcomes have come apart from each other and who is now holding both pieces and unable to make them fit back together. They refused, she continued, refused the territory, refused to discuss any arrangement. And then they sent scouts. To look at us, Varka said. To look at him, Senna said. And now there's this. Why didn't you tell me, Varka said. Because you would have said no. Yes. And I thought, Senna paused, and when she continued, her voice had changed registers slightly, dropped into something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived near both. I thought if I fixed it myself, if I found the answer and brought it to you already solved, I wouldn't have to watch you carry one more thing you didn't have a way to solve. She pressed her lips together. I thought I was protecting you. Varka looked at her oldest friend, her most difficult friend. The person who had stood at her left shoulder through 11 years of difficult mornings, who had disagreed with her more than anyone in the clan and supported her more than anyone in the clan, often in the same conversation, who had the scar on her face from a story she had never told, and who had never once asked for anything she wasn't prepared to earn. She didn't trust herself to find the right words quickly enough, so she did something else. She crossed the room and put her arms around Senna. Senna's body went rigid. That was always her first response to tenderness. The old reflex of someone who had learned early that softness created openings, and that openings could be used against you. Then, slowly, gradually, she came apart. Not dramatically, not with the performance of emotion, just the way something came apart when it had been holding together under sustained pressure, and something finally interrupted the holding. Her breathing changed. Her hands found Varka's arms and gripped them the way you gripped something when you had been falling for a longer time and finally found something solid. "How scared are you?" Varka said. "Tell me honestly." Senna's breath came out all at once, like something released. "Every day," she said. "I'm scared every day." Varka held her. "Me too," she said. "I have been for years, I just can't show it." They stood in the longhouse with the weight of everything between them and no performance required. And it was the most honest moment Varka could remember in a very long time. She told the clan that evening, not all of it, not the 8 weeks of Senna's secret communication, not the full anatomy of the failure. That was between the two of them and would remain there. But the message, yes, the ironback and what it meant and what was likely coming. She told them the way she always told them difficult things, directly without the softening that would have been a kind of condescension masquerading as kindness. The clan received it the way they received hard news now, with the steadiness of people who had been through enough that another difficulty was a known quantity, even when it was an unwelcome one. Garrett was present. He stood at the edge of the group and listened with the focused attention of someone fitting pieces together. He understood more of the old tongue now than she would have predicted. Not enough to follow everything, but enough to feel the shape of what was being said, to catch words like threat and approaching in numbers. When she switched to the human tongue to address him directly, his eyes were already alert. 20 warriors, she said, maybe more when they arrive. They know you're here. He nodded once. How long? 3 days. 4 if the weather turns. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I can leave. If my being here is what's... No, she said. It was so immediate and flat that he stopped mid-sentence. You are not the problem, she said. Our borders are the problem. Our numbers are her miles are the problem. If you leave, we lose the possibility you represent and we still face everything else. Nothing improves. The equation doesn't change. He looked at her. Then what do you need from me? He said. She held his gaze for a moment. I need you to let me handle it, she said. I need you to trust that this is mine to handle. He read the distinction in that. She could see him reading it. And he nodded. Not passive agreement, the considered agreement of someone who understood why the boundary existed and respected it. She went to the ridge that night. She went alone, which was her habit in the late evenings. The hour before the settlement, fires were fully banked, and the sounds changed from the active sounds of people working to the quieter sounds of people resting. She went to think, which meant she went to be somewhere that didn't require her to be anything in particular for anyone, which was the specific rest that a leader needed and almost never acknowledged needing. She was surprised to find Garrett already there. They had, she realized, been developing an unspoken rotation, both of them drawn to the same place in the early evenings, each arriving and finding the other, each backing away to wait, until the pattern became clear enough that they had simply, without discussing it, begun to allow the overlap. He was sitting on the long, flat rock that looked out over the valley, the one where the limestone had broken along a clean horizontal line and created something that functioned as a natural seat without being designed as one. He didn't look at her when she arrived. He was watching the settlement lights come on below, fire by fire, the valley filling up from the bottom. She sat at the other end of the rock, not close, the appropriate distance of two people who had not resolved what proximity meant between them. You can't sleep either, he said. She looked at him. That wasn't a statement about tonight, he said. That was a general observation. No, she said, not usually, not for a long time. He nodded, looked at the valley. I spent 3 years in the military, he said, and the first thing they take from you is sleep. Not intentionally, just The body stops trusting quiet. Quiet started meaning something was wrong. Something was about to happen. Varka listened. It takes a long time to get it back, he said, if you ever do. Have you? She said. He looked at the valley for a long moment. Some nights, he said, more than when I got here. They sat in silence for a while. The comfortable kind. Not the silence of two people who have run out of things to say, but the silence of two people who have enough between them that quiet didn't need filling. Varka, he said. She looked at him. The Ironback, he said. When they come, you said you'd handle it. Yes, I want you to know I understand why. He looked at her directly. It's not that you don't trust me. It's that this is your territory, your negotiation. And me being out there changes what the conversation is before you've said a word. She looked at him. Yes, she said, and that I would make it harder even trying to help. She was quiet for a moment. The Ironback have already decided what story this is, she said. A human male in Orc territory, Bone Valley compromised. They come with a story already written, and they need one thing from this meeting, confirmation of that story. She looked out at the valley. If you walk out there, the story writes itself and everything I say becomes a footnote to it. And if you walk out alone, he said, then they have to write a new story, she said. And people are very uncomfortable writing new stories. It slows them down. He almost smiled. He had a way of almost smiling that she had come to recognize as the version of it he trusted most. Not the full smile which he deployed for Pip and occasionally for Elder Mora's more theatrical performances, but the smaller one held back. The one that appeared when something struck him as genuinely accurate. You're going to be terrifying, he said. She looked back at the valley. I'm going to be necessary, she said. That's usually enough. The Ironback arrived on the morning of the fourth day. The sky was the color of hammered pewter, flat and bright, the specific quality of late autumn light that made everything look slightly more permanent than it was. 23 warriors, she counted when they appeared at the tree line, plus their leader, Korath. She had heard of Korath without having met him, which was how you knew someone was significant in this part of the mountains. Their reputation arrived ahead of them and stayed after they left. He was large in the way that some leaders were large, not just physically, but in the amount of space they occupied in a room, the way the air around them seemed to rearrange itself. He wore his authority the way he wore his furs, completely, without thinking about it, having never had a real reason to question whether it fit. They stopped at the settlement's boundary. Varka walked out to meet them. She had told Garrett to stay in the settlement's interior. She had not asked. She had stated it as operational information. He had nodded. Senna and the other hunters were visible at the settlement entrance, weapons sheathed, present as a fact rather than a threat. Varka crossed the open ground alone. 23 pairs of eyes plus Korath's followed her across the distance between them. She kept her pace even, unhurried, the pace of someone who had already determined the shape of this conversation and was simply walking to where it would take place. Korath looked down at her. Varka of Bone Valley, he said. His voice had the depth of someone whose chest had never needed to work for volume. We've come regarding the human situation. There is no situation, she said. He held her gaze with the patience of someone accustomed to people disagreeing with him before eventually coming around. There is a human male in your settlement. That constitutes a situation. That constitutes a fact, she said. Facts and situations are different things. One is what is. The other is what you decide it means. Something shifted slightly in Korath's expression. She suspected he had prepared for several opening positions from her, and this was not among them. He belongs in human territory, Korath said. Keeping him here creates complications. The border agreements, the other clans. He belongs where he chooses to be, she said. That's how belonging works. You don't get to choose where a person belongs from the outside. That's not belonging, that's ownership. We could take him, Korath said, for his own safety. He watched her face when he said it. She understood exactly what he was watching for. He was watching for the mathematics of size expressing itself, for the accommodation that came from a clan of 38 when confronted with a clan of 100, the small but visible contraction of a position under pressure. She didn't give him that. She looked at him evenly. You could try, she said. And she said it the way you said something that was simply a fact rather than a challenge. Not heated, not elevated, just present. The way the mountain was present, the way the cold was present, something that had been there before any of this conversation began and would be there after it ended. The silence between them had weight. 23 warriors, and you could hear the wind moving through bare branches 40 feet above. Korath read her. She could feel him doing it, the assessment that experienced leaders ran on each other, looking not at words or even posture, but at the thing underneath both of those, the quality that told you whether the person across from you would hold or give when the real pressure came. She had been holding for 11 years. She held now. And then she spoke the words that had come to her at 3 in the morning, 2 nights before. The words that were not strategy, but simply the truth stated plainly enough that it became difficult to argue with. Your clan has warriors to spare, she said. I know your numbers. We both do. Good for you. Strength is worth having. We have 38 people and no margin. We both know what the mathematics of that looks like over the next 20 years if nothing changes. You come here thinking that taking one man from us solves something for you, oh. I'm telling you it doesn't. It means Bone Valley fails slightly faster. And when we're gone, the territory we hold on the eastern slope goes to whoever fills the empty space. She paused. You've been using that slope as a buffer for 15 years, she said. Think about what happens when the buffer is gone. She watched him think about it. Orcs were strategic. The border conflicts had never properly accounted for this. The assumption that strength in orc culture meant directness, that size meant simplicity. Korath was neither simple nor direct. He was large and experienced, and he was currently working through a calculation that he had not arrived here expecting to make. And she could watch him arriving at the conclusion she had arrived at 3 nights ago on the ridge. Bone Valley's eastern territory was a buffer that functioned because Bone Valley maintained it. A buffer that stopped functioning became a gap. And gaps in the mountains were not neutral. They were invitations. Korath looked at his warriors, then back at her. We'll be watching, he said. Everyone is always watching, Varka said. We're still here. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he turned, and 23 warriors turned with him, and they walked back toward the tree line. Varka stood in the open ground and watched them until the last of them disappeared into the forest. Then she let her shoulders drop by exactly the amount she had been holding them up. Just for a moment. Just that much. Then she walked back to her clan. After the Ironback left, the settlement was quieter than usual for the rest of that day. The particular quiet of people who had been watching something happen and were now absorbing what they had seen. Varka moved through it, checking in with the hunters, reassuring the younger women, speaking briefly with Zelka about the eastern border rotation. She found Senna at the settlement's southern edge as the light was going, sitting on the supply cache with a blade in her lap that she had already sharpened twice that day. Senna looked at her. Not the way she usually looked at Varka, not the assessment, not the calculation of disagreement, but something different, something quieter. That was you, she said, out there. It was, Varka agreed. Senna was quiet for a moment. Then, I've watched you lead for 11 years. She paused. I didn't always agree. You know I didn't always agree. I know. But I've never doubted you were the right person to be doing it. Senna looked at the blade in her lap. Even when I thought you were wrong. Even when I went behind your back because I was scared enough to be stupid. Varka sat beside her. Senna, she said. I know, Senna said. We're not going to talk about it. I just needed to say that. She paused. And I needed you to know that what I saw out there today, she shook her head slightly. That was why you're at the front. That's all. Varka looked at the darkening sky above the settlement. Thank you, she said. Senna shrugged, the efficient shrug of someone returning to business. Don't make it a thing. I wouldn't dare, Varka said. Senna almost smiled. The smallest possible version of it, gone before you could be sure it had been there. But Varka had known her long enough. 3 days after the Ironback left, Aldwin arrived. He came through the southern pass in the late afternoon with the slightly desperate energy of someone who had been moving too fast and was now confronting the reality that the destination was more complicated than the journey. Young, probably not yet 25, possibly younger. Brown hair, freckles at the bridge of his nose, a military uniform that was official enough to carry authority and worn enough to suggest he placed only moderate stock in authorities' claims. He stopped at the settlement's entrance. He looked at the assembled women of Bone Valley looking back at him. He became very still. Garrett, he managed. Garrett, former 1st Battalion Border Regiment. I have a message for him. I'm here, Garrett said from near the central fire. Aldwin's relief was immediate and slightly comical. The relief of someone who had built up to something difficult and found the first step easier than expected. He walked forward with the careful posture of a young man trying to appear less frightened than he was, which was a strategy that worked considerably better when the audience wasn't paying close attention. A message from Commander Holt, he said. Your unit. They've listed you as missing, presumed gone. They need confirmation of your status. Garrett took the message, read it, set it down with the same deliberateness Varka had used with the Ironback letter, the gesture of someone deciding something while their hands were occupied. Tell them I'm alive, he said. Tell them I'm safe. Aldwin waited. The continuation was obvious. Tell them I'm staying where I am, Garrett said, with people who need me more than a border regiment does. Aldwin blinked. Sir, they'll call you a deserter. You understand what that means. They'll say you let them, Garrett said. Not heated, not elevated, just completely flat, the way you stated something you had already resolved so thoroughly that the stating of it required almost no energy. Aldwin looked at him for a long moment, then at Varka, who was standing to one side, present but not looming, giving the conversation room while making clear she was part of it. Then at Pip, who had materialized from somewhere and was standing near Garrett's left side, holding the compass, studying Aldwin with the focused curiosity of a child who had decided he was interesting and intended to determine exactly why. Then Aldwin did something unexpected. He smiled. It was small, slightly sad at the edges, the smile of someone understanding something they hadn't arrived expecting to understand. You look happy, he said to Garrett. I've known you for 3 years. I don't think I've ever seen you look happy. Garrett said nothing. I'll deliver your message, Aldwin said. I'll tell them you're alive and staying. He paused, looking at Pip with the compass, at the fires in the settlement, and the women watching from doorways. I'll tell them you found something worth more than duty. He straightened, looked at Varka one more time with an expression she did not have a precise name for, but that shared a border with respect. Good luck, he said. You're going to need it. He turned and walked back toward the southern pass, and the trees closed around him, and the settlement was quiet. Varka stood in the settling silence. She looked at the tree line where Aldwin had disappeared. She looked at Garrett, who was watching the same point in the trees. She looked at Pip, who had already turned her attention back to the compass, turning it over in her small hands, apparently satisfied that the compass would tell her what she needed to know when she needed to know. Varka thought about what Aldwin had said. You look happy. She thought about her own face. She tried to read it from the outside, which was an impossible task, and she knew it, but she tried anyway. The experiment of seeing yourself the way someone who didn't need you to be strong might see you. She wasn't sure what she found, but she thought it might be something she didn't yet have a word for, something adjacent to happy, something on its way to becoming it. She went to check the eastern border. That was always the last thing, had been the last thing for years. She walked the perimeter in the cold evening air, checking each marker, reading the ground for disturbance, doing the work that kept the space between what they had and what could threaten it clear and known. It was a habit. It was also a practice, the nightly act of saying, I am still here. This is still mine to keep. We are still here. She was turning back toward the settlement when she stopped. Not because she heard anything, not because anything was wrong, because she had realized something. Standing in the dark between the marker trees with the wind coming down off the ridge and the settlement fires visible as small, warm points through the branches. She had been doing this for 11 years, checking the borders alone, carrying the perimeter in her body the way you carried something that had no one else to carry it, that existed in the world only because you kept it in existence. She had done it so consistently that she had stopped noticing she was doing it, the way you stopped noticing the weight of something you'd carried long enough. She noticed it tonight. She noticed it, and then she noticed something else. It was lighter than it had been. Not because anything had changed about the borders or the threats or the work required to maintain them. Because she was less alien in the carrying. She stood with that for a moment. Then she walked home. Part 3. Vala and the Compass. There is a kind of morning that feels like an answer arriving. Not loudly, not with the clean drama of revelation, just the quiet appearance of something that was always going to be true. The way the sun rose, not because you needed it to, but because that was what suns did. Because persistence was in the nature of things that mattered. Varka was at the eastern border when Zelka came running. Not the careful, controlled movement of a hunter on patrol. Running openly with the energy of someone carrying news that was too large for any other pace. Varka turned. "She's here," Zelka said. "Come now, Varka. She's here." The child was small. All babies were small. Varka understood this as a fact, had held it as knowledge for as long as she'd had language for it. But there was something about the reality of it that knowledge hadn't fully prepared her for, the way certain experiences only existed at full size when they were actually happening and could not be adequately represented in advance. The weight of something complete in such a small form. The smell of new life, which was unlike every other smell in the world, which was something no one had thought to describe to her and which she understood now, holding this small warm weight, was genuinely indescribable. She was green, the child. Green-skinned the way of her mother, Hessa, 22 years old, the youngest adult woman in the clan, who was lying with the total exhaustion of someone who had done something enormous and had earned the right to simply exist horizontally for a while. And the child's face, Varka studied it in the firelight. This face that was still becoming what it was going to be, carried something else in its lines. Something in the set of the nose, in the breadth of the forehead that was neither fully orc nor fully human, that was completely and entirely its own thing. Unclassifiable, preceding all categories. A bridge, made flesh, made real. "What will you call her?" Elder Morris said. She was in the corner of the birthing room, humming so quietly it was almost below hearing. The sound a person made when they were too moved for full song but couldn't manage complete silence either. Varka looked at the child. She had thought about this, had thought about it in the spaces between sleeping and waking, in the minutes at the eastern border, in the evenings on the ridge. She had thought about what it meant to name something, to take the open space of a new life and give it language, to say, "This is what I see when I look at what we have made." "Vala," she said. Mora stopped humming. "Old words," she said, "the old tongue." "Bridge," Varka said, "in the oldest version of the old tongue." Mora looked at the child for a long time. Then she began to sing properly. The full voice, the one she reserved for the moments that required more than ordinary sound to hold them. The naming ceremony song, the one she had sung at every birth Varka could remember, which meant she had been singing it long before Varka was born and would be singing it as long as she had breath. Varka stood in the small room with a new life against her chest and listened to an old woman sing a new beginning and felt the thing move through her that had been building for months. The unnamed thing, the thing larger than hope or warmth or relief, the thing that lived below language and was only now finding its way up. Garrett appeared in the doorway. He looked at the child, at Varka holding the child. He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him being quiet on purpose. The deliberateness of someone choosing not to put words on something before it was ready for them. "She's perfect," he said finally. Varka looked down at Vala's face. "She's a beginning," Varka said. Winter passed. Spring came up through the mountain with the persistence it brought every year. Green pushing through frost-softened ground, the creek running full with snowmelt, birds arriving in the sequence they always arrived, reliable as anything she knew. The ordinary miracle of continuation, which looked so much like itself that you could forget to notice it was miraculous. More children came, not many, not fast. The work of recovery was slow, indifferent to urgency, responsive only to time and care, and the kind of patience that was not passive but active. The patience of tending, of showing up daily to the work of making something grow that had to grow at its own rate and could not be hurried without being damaged. 2 more in the first year after Vala, 1 the year after that. Small numbers that were everything. The difference between a line ending and a line turning. The settlement changed in sounds first. The sounds of small children were different from the sounds of adult women, higher, more chaotic, the unpredictable music of people who had not yet learned that the world required modulation, who moved through life at full volume because they hadn't been taught otherwise. Bone Valley had been quiet for so long in the particular way it had been quiet that Varka had stopped noticing the specific texture of that quiet. The remembering was not painful. It was the feeling of a room open that had been closed for too long, air moving through a space that had held still past its time. Pip had taken to the younger children with the wholehearted seriousness she brought to everything she cared about. She was 10, then 11, growing tall and serious in the way of young people who had decided who they were and were now simply becoming more fully that thing with each season. She explained things to the younger ones with the confidence of someone who had assembled her education from unusual sources. A human man, a very old woman who sang everything, and a leader who said exactly what she meant and had made something distinctive from the combination. She was training to be a hunter under Senna's instruction, which meant she was being trained to an exacting standard by someone who considered the gap between what you were capable of and what you were achieving to be a personal problem that she had a professional responsibility to address. She still carried the compass. Always. It had become part of her in the way certain objects became part of certain people, not as an accessory but as an extension, something the hand went to automatically, something the eye registered when it was absent. She had shown it to every one of the younger children, explaining with patient seriousness that it pointed home, that home was here, that this required no further demonstration or evidence. Garrett was different with the children than she had expected him to be. Patient in a way that wasn't performed. The patience of someone who understood that small people were not incomplete large people, but were their own entire thing, deserving full attention on their own terms. He taught the older ones about weather and woodcraft and the human names for constellations, which differed from the orc names in ways that created productive arguments about which names made more sense. Arguments that Zelka refereed with the philosophical seriousness of someone who had discovered that disagreements about stars were good practice for disagreements about everything else. He sat with his youngest ones and simply existed near them, which was sometimes what young things needed most and was harder to provide than it looked. She thought about his father sometimes, watching this. The carpenter, the good furniture that lasted, the hands that made things built to remain. What hands did you pass on when you had no furniture to build? Elder Mora died on a Tuesday in the second winter after Vala's birth. She had been declining since the first frost, not sharply, which she would not have accepted, which she would have argued with on principle, but the way old things declined in the mountains, gradually losing edges, becoming more essentially themselves with each passing season, the way water wore stone and left behind something cleaner. She was singing when it happened. Of course she was. The song she had been singing for as long as any of them could remember. The oldest one, the one that predated the memory of anyone living, that she had learned from someone who had learned it from someone else in a chain of transmission that went back further than the settlement, further than the valley. She was singing and then she was not. Varka sat beside her for a long time before she told anyone. She needed the time. She needed to make something too large into a size she could carry out of that room and into the settlement and be the person the next several hours would require her to be, which was the person who held the center while everyone else felt what they needed to feel. She said goodbye in private. Then she went out. They burned her at dusk on the eastern slope, where the sky opened up toward the ridge and the smoke could rise without obstruction. The whole clan was there, the women, the children, and Garrett, who stood with his hands at his sides and his face open in the way she had learned to recognize as his version of grief, the way he looked when he was letting something reach him completely, rather than managing the approach. Varka stood at the front. She had not planned to sing. It was not a decision that lived in the thinking part of her mind. It was the other kind, the older kind, the kind the body made before the mind had finished the question. She opened her mouth. The song that came out was the one Mora had taught her when she was 10 years old. When Varka had been the youngest member of the clan, and Mora had been already old, ancient, and patient, and relentless in her conviction that certain things needed music and that Varka, specifically, needed to understand this before she grew up and forgot. She had not sung it since she became leader. She sang it now. Her voice was not Mora's voice. Mora's voice had been specific and irreplaceable, shaped by decades of use, pointed always at the things that mattered most. Varka's voice was different, deeper, rougher, carrying a different weight, but the song was the same song. It survived the singer. That was what songs were built to do. The clan was completely still. She sang the whole of it while the fire took the pyre and the smoke rose, and the sky went from pewter to the deep bruised purple of oncoming dark. She sang while the youngest children held still, with the instinct of young things who understood that something was happening that was important in a way that required their complete attention, even if they didn't yet have words for what it was. She sang while Senna stood at her left with a lifted chin and wet eyes, the posture of someone refusing to let grief be undignified. She sang until the smoke was high. Then she was quiet. No one spoke for a long time. Then Garrett said quietly from somewhere just behind her left shoulder, "I didn't understand the words, but I understood it. She taught me that song when I was 10 years old," Varka said. "Told me I needed to know it before I grew up and forgot that some things required music." "Did you forget?" She watched the smoke rise and spread against the darkening sky. "For a while," she said, "when you're carrying enough and the margin is thin, you become very practical. You stop doing the things that aren't immediately necessary. You make yourself efficient and you tell yourself efficiency is virtue." She looked at the smoke. "She reminded me," Varka said. "She never stopped. That was her gift and her particular aggravation. She never let anything stay forgotten for long." Garrett was quiet. She heard him shift his weight. "Some people do that," he said. "They hold things so other people don't have to. They keep something alive in the room that would go out without them." Varka thought about this. "Yes," she said. "That was exactly what she did." After the ceremony, after the clan had slowly dispersed to their fires, Senna found her at the edge of the pyre site. The ashes were still warm. The smoke had thinned to nothing. The sky above was fully dark now, the stars coming out over the eastern ridge. Senna sat beside her without asking, which was Senna's way. She went where she was needed without requiring permission. They were quiet for a while. Then Senna said, "He stayed." "Yes," Varka said. "I was wrong about him." Not an apology, just Senna, naming a fact she had verified to her own rigorous standard and was now formally recording. "I know," Varka said. "Don't make it a thing." "I wouldn't dare," Varka said. Senna almost smiled. Almost. The smallest possible version of it. There and gone. But Varka had known her long enough to count it. The years settled. This was what years did when you stopped fighting them. They settled, took on the specific texture of a life being lived rather than a crisis being survived. The distinction was not dramatic. It was subtle, internal. The difference in how you woke up in the morning, whether the first thought of the day was a problem to be solved or simply the ordinary resumption of something ongoing. Varka had been solving problems every morning for 11 years. She still solved problems. The mountains did not become generous, but the first thought had changed. The quality of it had changed. She noticed this without quite being able to account for it. The Ironback sent a message in the second year. Different from the first, no ultimatum, no numbers, no implicit threat. Just a question, scratched into bark and left at the eastern marker. How had Bone Valley done it? Varka sent back 3 words. "We stopped waiting." She never received another message from them. The watching stopped not long after. The human territories beyond the southern pass remained the human territories beyond the southern pass. Complicated, distant, occasionally sending travelers who stumbled into Bone Valley land, looking confused and hungry, who were given food and pointed north, and who left with the particular expression of people who had expected something and encountered something else entirely. Pip was 13. She was tall for it, long-limbed, with the focused intensity of a young person who had decided exactly who she was and was now in the continuous process of becoming more fully that thing. Senna's student in hunting, which meant she was being held to standards that most adults would find demanding, and she was meeting them. She still carried the compass. She would carry it, Varka suspected, for the rest of her life. Not out of sentiment, exactly, but out of the particular conviction of someone who had decided something was true and saw no reason to revise the decision based on evidence that hadn't arrived yet. One afternoon, Varka watched Pip explaining the compass to 2 of the youngest children, both of them perhaps 4 years old, both of them looking up at her with the complete credulity that very small people extended to anyone who spoke with sufficient confidence. It points home, Pip said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. See the needle? It looks like it's not moving, but it is, just very slowly, just pointing. One of the small ones reached for it. Pip held it lower so she could see. Where's home? The child asked. Pip looked at her with the expression she used for questions she considered to already be their own answer. Here, she said, obviously. Commander Holt arrived on a Wednesday in the 5th year. He came alone, which was the first thing to notice. A man in a military uniform, older than the version of him Varka had constructed from Garrett's sparse descriptions. The reality was more worn, more complicated in the face, carrying the specific weight of a person who had made a great many significant decisions and was not entirely at peace with the accounting. He presented himself at the settlement's entrance in the early afternoon and waited, which was also something to notice. Varka met him herself. She walked to the entrance and stood in front of him and looked at him with the full, direct assessment she had used on Korath. Not aggression, simply accuracy, the act of seeing someone clearly before words began. He returned the assessment without flinching. Varka, he said, I'm Commander Holt. I believe you know why I'm here. I know 2 reasons you might be here, she said. You've come to take Garrett back, or you've run out of better options and you need something you can point to when people ask why things aren't working. Holt was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his expression. The second one, he said, mostly the second. Come in, she said. We'll feed you, then we'll talk. She fed him, not ceremony, practical and direct. Roasted meat, the bread that had become a settlement staple since Hessa found the technique that worked in mountain conditions, preserved vegetables from the stores. She sat across from him at the table in the longhouse with no one else present, which was a statement about the conversation they were about to have and who was conducting it. Garrett was there, but he sat to one side, slightly behind, in the position that said, I'm here, but this is not mine to lead. He had learned this. She had not taught it to him. He had arrived at it himself, which was what made it genuine. Holt ate with the thorough efficiency of someone who knew how to be grateful for food without performing gratitude. Then he set down his plate and looked at her directly. The discharge papers are official, he said. 3 months ago, Garrett is listed as killed in action. Battle of Thornridge, confirmation delayed. His pension, such as it is, has been processed. He placed a document on the table. For your records, he said, in case they become relevant. Varka looked at the document, at the official seal that declared a living man legally dead, then at Holt. The other thing, she said. He folded his hands. There's a faction in the High Council that wants formal coexistence agreements, he said. Not peace treaties. Those haven't held. Something different. Regional compacts, defined territories, trade provisions at the borders. He paused. The faction is small. The opposition is louder. But the numbers from the past 2 decades don't work for anyone. We've all lost more than we've gained, and the people on both sides who are honest about arithmetic know it. Varka listened. They need evidence, he continued. Something that already exists. That has survived the first years. That isn't a theory or a proposal, but something you can walk around in. He looked around the longhouse. Through the window, visible beyond, the fires, the structures, Zelka running a drill with the older children, Pip moving through the settlement with her particular focused stride. This place, he said. She was quiet for a moment. You want to use my clan as a political argument, she said. I want to use your clan as evidence, he said. There's a distinction. Evidence doesn't require the thing to perform or advocate. It only requires the thing to exist, to be undeniable. She looked at him. The people you're trying to convince, she said. Will they come here? Will there be observers? Will we be asked to demonstrate ourselves to people who need persuading? Holt held her gaze. Possibly, he said. I won't tell you it will be simple, because it won't. She thought about 11 years of border checks in the dark, about Senna's hands gripping her arms in the longhouse, about the ironback standing at the tree line and the space between them that she had crossed alone, about Vala running between the settlement fires and Mora's smoke rising, and Pip holding the compass with absolute certainty about what it pointed at. She thought about what it ought to be evidence. She thought about what it can't not to be one. I will think about it, she said. Holt nodded. He understood this was not deferral, but process. That thinking preceded deciding, and that she was not a person who reversed that order. He stood. "Garrett," he said. He extended his hand and Garrett shook it with the uncomplicated directness of a man who had nothing to perform for anyone. "You look well," Holt said. "I am well," Garrett said. The two men looked at each other for a moment. The residue of a history that had ended and not been entirely resolved, the particular texture of a connection that had been severed by choice and was now being acknowledged as something that had existed and mattered and was now finished. Holt nodded. Then he turned toward the entrance. He was 3 steps from the settlement's edge when the voice stopped him. "Wait," Pip's voice. She had been at the periphery for the past hour, which everyone had noticed and no one had mentioned. Because Pip at the periphery, with her attention fully engaged, meant she was building towards something. And interrupting that process before it was ready was both futile and inadvisable. She was ready now. She walked up to Commander Holt with her hand already moving to her pocket, her chin level, her eyes carrying the particular certainty of someone who had made a decision completely and was now executing it. She was 13 years old. She walked like someone who knew exactly how much space she was entitled to take up. Holt looked down at her. "What is it?" he said. His tone was not condescending. She would not have accepted condescension, and her face communicated this without requiring words. Pip pulled the compass from her pocket. She held it for a moment. The handling of something carried long enough that the hands knew it completely. The brass was warm from her pocket. The needle was still, as it had always been still, as it would always be still, pointing nowhere and everywhere, and at whatever interpretation you brought to it. She held it out toward Holt. He looked at it, then at her. "This was Garrett's," Pip said. "His father made it. It used to point home." Holt looked uncertain whether to take it. "Garrett found his home," Pip said. She glanced at Garrett briefly, the smallest acknowledgement. "He doesn't need it to point anymore. He's already there." Holt said nothing. "You've been traveling a long time," Pip said, "trying to figure out where things should go, how things could work." She looked at him steadily. "You're going back to your city and your council and your argument about what's possible. And you're going to need something." She held the compass toward him more firmly. "Take it. It doesn't point north. But it points somewhere, and maybe if you know what you're looking for, that's enough to get started." Holt looked at this 13-year-old with her steady hand and her complete conviction. He reached out. He took the compass. He held it the way Garrett had always held it, cupped, weighted, with the seriousness of something that was small in his palm and heavy in a way that had nothing to do with brass. He looked at the needle. "Where does it point?" he said. "The way you mean it." Pip looked at him with the patience of someone explaining something that should be obvious to someone who was trying very hard to understand it and was almost there. "Home," she said. "But you have to know what home is before it can show you." Holt closed his hand around the compass. He stood there for a moment. Then he looked at Varka. Something moved across his face that she had no precise name for. The expression of a person who arrived to give something and found themselves leaving with something instead, and who was recognizing in real time that this was not the loss it appeared to be. "Thank you," he said. He said it to all of them. To the settlement and the fires and Zelka watching from a distance and the small children peering around corners. To Senna, who was standing at the edge of the clearing with her arms crossed and her expression doing something complicated. To Garrett. To Pip, who received his gratitude with a nod that indicated it was appropriate but not surprising. Then he walked into the trees. Varka watched until the sound of him had fully merged with the ordinary sounds of the forest. Wind in branches, the creek below, a bird on the ridge calling once and going quiet. Then she was still. That evening she went to the ridge. She went alone, as she always had, to the hour before the fires were banked and the valley had its specific end-of-day conversation with itself. She went to the long flat rock that looked out over everything she had spent 11 years keeping alive. She heard him coming before she saw him. He had gotten quieter over 5 years, had learned the mountain in the way a person had to learn it, slowly with attention, with willingness to be taught by terrain that had no interest in your timeline. But she always heard him. She had learned the particular sound of him, the way you learn the sounds of things that mattered. He came and sat at the other end of the rock. The valley below was lighting fire by fire, the settlement filling up with its evening sounds. Low voices, children being gathered in, the echo of something that wasn't Mora's voice and would never again be Mora's voice, but was carrying the same song forward in different air. "You're thinking," he said. "Always," she said. He looked at the valley. At Vala, visible even from here, running between the structures with the total commitment of a 3-year-old who had recently discovered that speed was possible and was conducting comprehensive research into its applications. Half green, half not, entirely herself, entirely outside the categories she was supposed to fall between. "Holt will come back," Garrett said. "Or send others?" "Yes," she said. "And then what?" She looked at the valley for a long moment. "Then we decide what we're willing to be," she said, "and what we're not. Those are separate decisions and both of them matter." He nodded. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I came here with." She looked at him. 3 weeks of being lost," he said, "a broken compass pointing nowhere. No plan past the next hour." He was quiet for a moment. "I was past caring about most things by the time you found me." "You probably noticed that. I noticed," she said. "And I thought, when you said I could stay, when I was deciding, I thought I was doing you a favor." He paused. "Staying because you needed me, because I was useful to something." Varka waited. "I've been understanding for a while now that I had it exactly backward," he said. He looked at the valley. "You didn't need me to save you. You had been saving yourselves for years. What you offered me was something different." "What was that?" she said. "A reason to stop going nowhere," he said. "A direction that wasn't just away from things." She looked at him. He looked at her. He had been looking at her for some time in the way that had developed slowly enough that she couldn't have identified the moment it changed. Not as assessment, not as gratitude, not as the careful management of something uncertain. Just looking. The full attention version. The kind that didn't need to arrive anywhere. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever Holt is bringing, whatever comes from the council, whatever the next hard thing is, I'm here because this is where I am. Not because I owe you something, and not because I have nowhere else." She looked at him. "Because you chose it," she said. "Every day," he said. She thought about what it meant to choose something every day. Not the single dramatic choice, the moment at the campfire or the moment at the ridge after the Ironback left. The daily version. The ordinary, ongoing version that didn't feel like a choice most days because it had become so completely what you were that the alternative wasn't imaginable. She had been choosing this valley every day for 11 years. She understood exactly what he meant. "I thought home was the thing you protected," she said. "The structure, the territory, the fact of survival, the walls you held against everything trying to get through." She paused. "I spent years protecting home as if it were a fixed thing. Given. Pre-existing. Something that would be there whether or not I kept choosing it." She looked at the valley below. "I know better now," she said. "Home is the thing you build, out of whatever you have, out of what arrives and what you make with it and who decides to stay." She looked at him. "And it's never finished," she said. "That's what I didn't understand for a long time. It's always in the process of being home, always requiring the next day, always the thing you choose again." Garrett looked at her with the eyes that had been watching her carefully for 5 years and had learned the landscape. He almost said something, then he didn't. Some things were sized wrong for language. Some things needed to stay in the space just before the saying, because the almost said was more honest than any fully said version could be, and they both understood this, and neither of them required the other to do it differently. They sat together on the rock while the dark came fully in and the stars appeared over the ridge. Cold, numerous, unchanged by anything that happened below them. The same stars that had been there the night Bren died, and the night Garrett appeared at the campfire, and the night Vala was born, and every night between and after. Vala's voice carried up from the settlement. Not words, she was 3, her words were still finding themselves. Just sound. The high, clear sound of a small person in the middle of something joyful, completely inside the moment. Nothing held back. Varka listened to it. She let it arrive completely, without the management that leadership required, without the careful distance she had trained herself to maintain. Just the sound of a child laughing in a valley in the Appalachian Mountains on a cold November evening, carried up the hillside on the air, reaching her and landing. Just that. Garrett heard it too. She could tell from the way his breathing changed, the small involuntary softening that happened when something reached him before he could decide whether to let it. "She's going to be trouble," he said. "Yes," Varka said. "The good kind, the best kind." They were quiet. Below them, the valley held everything they had made. Not finished, never finished. Always in the process of becoming. The fires burned. The children moved through the firelight. The women of Bone Valley went about the last of the evening's work with the ease of people who were home and knew it and did not require the knowledge to be stated because it lived in their bodies, in their hands, in the automatic geography of moving through a space that was yours. Varka had built this. She had not built it alone. She understood that now, had been understanding it slowly and fully for years. But she had been at the front of the line. She had been the one who checked the borders every night and held the center when the center was only her and kept going when the keeping going was the entire plan. She had walked out of the trees into a dying campfire's light and made a decision that everyone around her thought was wrong, and she would make it again. She would make it 1,000 times, not because it had been easy, because it had been necessary, and necessity and rightness were sometimes the same thing, and she had learned to trust that equation. She looked at the valley, at Pip moving through the firelight below, tall and serious and purposeful. The compass gone now from her pocket but not from her, carried the way you carried things that had become part of you. Not in your hands but in your understanding of what pointed where and why. At Vala, finally captured by Hessa and held still, small green arms reaching toward the fire with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been refused anything important. At the settlement itself, the structures and the fires and the sound of it, which was so different from what it had been that the old version of it was hard to reconstruct, hard to hold in the mind alongside the current version. They coexisted imperfectly. The before and the now. She preferred the now. She preferred it with the specific, grounded preference of someone who had lived through enough of before to know exactly what the now was worth. "Are you cold?" Garrett asked. "Not yet," she said. He nodded. "Tell me when." She would. When she was cold, she would tell him, and they would go down to the settlement and the fire and the ordinary evening sounds of a place that was, by any reasonable measure, improbable, that should not have existed and did exist and would go on existing because people had chosen it every day and would keep choosing it. But not yet. Not for a while yet. The stars were out in full now, the whole winter constellation wheeling slowly above the ridge, and the valley breathed below them with the life that had been built inside it. And Varka sat in the place where the cold came down and the warmth came up and felt them both at once. She had spent a long time being at war with the cold. She had learned somewhere in the past 5 years to let them both be there. The cold and the warmth, the difficulty and the good thing. The years of being alone and the fact of not being alone now, they didn't cancel each other out. They coexisted the way everything real coexisted, imperfectly, completely, without resolving into something cleaner than the truth. She breathed out. Garrett was quiet beside him. Somewhere below, Vala's voice rose again, that clear, high note, the sound of someone who had not yet learned that the world required less than complete expression of what you felt. Varka listened to it. She let it matter. She let it be exactly the size it was. Not managed, not contained, not kept at the distance that leadership required. Just the sound of her valley and the life in it and the fact, the plain and extraordinary fact of still being here. Still here. After everything, still here and building.